Hi, and welcome to Healthier Family Relationship. I am so excited to have you for another day. And today we are going to go deep into the subject. We are going to talk with Dr. Ali Lankerani. Our speaker today has been voted twice as America's top doctors. He is a clinical neuroscientist and inspirational speaker, best-selling author, and an international coach. He is affectionately known as Dr. L, the Parent Whisperer. He is on a mission to support, inspire, and empower as many people as possible to step into their thrive and leave a legacy. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Lydia. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for honoring me, guests. I'm looking forward to our talk today.
Yes, so please tell us more. I just said, short introduction about you. I know that you have been doing so many things, so please tell us more about you and about what you are doing.
Yes, well, as you mentioned, I'm a clinical neuroscientist. I ran a private practice where I helped families who had children with autism spectrum disorders before I decided to step out of private practice and the healthcare setting to serve in a bigger way, to work in the prevention side of things as far as optimizing humanity's potential. And of course, I can say I'm not only the doctor, I'm also a former patient of this whole thing, because as I went through my postdoctorate in neurodevelopmental disorders, I discovered that growing up, I actually had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this was before the diagnosis existed. So I was always unanimously described by my teachers as this bright but mischievous kid that would spend the first 10 minutes getting the point of the lesson and spend the remaining 50 minutes interrupting and disrupting the class and my neighbors. So I was not an easy child. So I always start by apologizing to teachers and parents alike for my kind, basically. But I'm glad to be here and I've made it to this point.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. And it is very amazing to notice that you were able to go beyond that diagnosis, because you said that you didn't know about it, and it didn't stop you because many parents think that the child might be limited and don't push them to go beyond. And you did. So thank you about that. Can you tell us more about your journey and how everything fell into now being Dr. L, the Whisperer?
Absolutely. Well, I always joke that it's a miracle that I lasted in academia as long as I did. And it was not easy for me. And in fact, that became part of my mission. When I was in practice, I would see the kids that were 6, 7, 10, 12 years of age coming to us, and we were getting great results with them, getting the diagnosis removed and helping the families kind of regroup and optimize the future of their children. But the trouble was that they had already gone through that tender childhood period, and the kids had realized that they are different than those around them. And somehow they had internalized that as there is a problem with me. And also, parenting a child on the spectrum is not the usual standard parenting. So usually there's a lot of parental and parenting tensions as well. And then depending on how you were brought up, the couples oftentimes would be arguing and not agreeing on the best approach on the parenting, which would cause spousal relationship issues. And to cascade it even further, with the challenges that the children are facing, the parents wanted to do the best that they could. So oftentimes I would see that they're trying to throw everything as far as therapies are concerned into kids' lives, hoping that something sticks. And so they were financially strapped because of it as well. And that was the reason why I decided to step away from my private practice. My private practice was an award-winning practice, but I decided to step away from it because I did not want the children and the families to go through what I had gone through, to experience those difficulties, that I experienced growing up. You see, when I was growing up, I grew up in Iran during the revolution and then the Iran-Iraq war. And having a condition like ADHD was not very conducive to the environment and the situation at the time, because in order for you to be able to make a career, to go on with your life, you had to pass this national university entrance exam. And unless you were in the top 1% of the academic performers in the entire country, you were sent to the front lines to fight in the battlefields. So this was really a life and death situation. And as a child, you don't get the point of that. You're just growing up and oblivious to these dangers and these situations. So that pressure fell on my parents. And in the process of trying to get an ADHD kid to perform at that level, I would see the frustration in their faces. And again, I would think there's something wrong with me. I would see my younger sister go to school, come back within a couple of hours. She was finished with her homework and she was out in the backyard playing. And I wanted to go and play and I couldn't. Later on in college, I would be going to school and I would be coming home and I would look at my homework and it would take me about an hour to read 5 to 8 pages. And I had 80 pages to read as homework. I'm like, I'm never going to finish this. So it affected me morally, morale-wise as well, because no matter how hard I would try, I would come short. I wasn't good enough compared to other people that seemed to, with ease, be able to tackle these things. And nobody's there telling you that, there is a different way for you to process because your brain is different. So it became a very important thing for me to make sure that people understand and realize that different brains operate differently. And of course, it only took me a postdoctorate to realize that and be able to help people, help them understand the different phases of brain development. And ultimately, that's what I ended up focusing on in practice, and then ultimately in the online world. So I got the title of Parent Whisperer because in many cases, if you learn to work with the body, with the brain development, this is basically 21st century medicine, then you actually can improve things instead of having to fight against the body, fight against the current to go ahead and make a change happen, which oftentimes, because you're fighting against the system, is going to be short term with limited and smaller results. So if you can work with the body, it becomes almost effortless. The results become sustainable and lasting, and in many cases, actually fun, and instead of being grudgingly difficult.
Yes, and this is key, as you said, that people process things differently. So now they need to know how to learn. There is different ways to learn, and I wanted you to talk more about parenting. How parents, through the phases of their child's life, what should they do? Parenting through the 4 phases of your child's development. You said to me that we have four phases. So how can parents support their children?
Sure. Now, of course, this is a generalization, but I want you to have a understanding of how we humans as species come to be who we are and eventually become the adults that we are. So one of the things that, first of all, you need to understand is that in order for us humans to be able to survive through the birthing process, in order for the moms to be able to survive through the birthing process, our heads are too big to go through the birth canal. So it needs to be compressed. It cannot be fully developed. So we as a species are one of the only species that actually is born and developed without really being viable. So what does that mean? So if you're watching like Nature Channel and you see the birthing of a calf or a deer or something, you will see that sometimes within minutes, these things start getting up and following the herd or being able to take care of themselves in some minimal ways. But we as humans take almost 2 years to reach that point. We're not viable entities before then. So everything about us needs to develop, and that's because our brain is not fully developed. So having that understanding becomes essential when you're talking about these phases of development, because just like you turn on the computer and it checks all the systems, make sure it's operational, and starts communicating with the different parts, and then starts kind of building its own database, our brain is kind of similar in that sense. So we go through these phases, and our brain cannot develop all of those things simultaneously. So it switches from one side to the other and location wise. And then you need to also understand that our brain is one of the most specialized brains on this planet. So in fact, the reason our brain is so powerful is not because we have the biggest brain, because we don't. The reason for it is because we can utilize the most number of parts of our brain simultaneously in networking and connecting these different brain centers to do complex thought processes and complex actions. Now, if there is a problem where these things cannot connect properly, then the outcome from our brain ends up not being proper. And this is where the problems begin. But because we go through these different phases of development, many times you don't see the problem right away, or you see a problem and then it disappears and then it reappears years later in a completely different form and fashion. All right, I hope I'm not losing the audience members on this. I know that there's a lot of information on this, so at the end, I have something special for them so that they can help understand this a little bit better based on the principles that we're going to talk about today during the talk.
Yes, and about the principles, is it based on the age, or is it depends of the person?
So that's a good question. As a generalization, these are based on the age, because that's like, we basically have to get certain things done within a certain period of time while the brain is active in that, in developing that part of your brain. And if that part doesn't fully get done, if it's too early or too late, then the development of that part of the brain ends up being a little bit off. So later on, when the brain is building layer on top of layer, these other layers don't have a solid foundation in them. So if you've heard of something like developmental delays, that is a perfect example of one of these things that can later on manifest as learning disabilities, for instance, or ADHD or autism spectrum disorder and things like that. So it's important for us to know that these things kind of build on top of each other. So the phases are as follows. We have 4 phases that, like, I'm going to recommend it as such. The first year to 3 years of age, that phase, I call that your survival phase for children. That's the part where they're becoming viable. They're learning that they have a place in this universe. They're learning that, they're part of this universe. They have capabilities, and that they can interact with the universe. This is the foundational piece. They don't quite know yet that they're separate from the rest of the world. They kind of feel intertwined and connected, and they don't know where their body ends and the rest of the world begins. You can kind of see that in some baby that is trying to walk or trying to reach for things. They don't quite know where their arm begins or ends and how to grasp and reach for stuff. But they do learn early on that, hey, you know what? If I've got a string attached to my hand and I do this, then this thing that's up on top makes this jingly noise. Or that if I smile, then this face that's in front of me smiles back. So they learn to start interacting with their environment. Now, they also are learning about their body and how to move it in gravity, because they were in utero before, and there was water and they didn't need much movement. Their entire system, their digestive system, respiratory system, immune system, their brain, all of these things are basically now becoming vital, they're becoming capable of operating. So that's the first 3 years. In this phase, it is essential for the child to feel that they are, their survival is not at risk. Because when that happens, that they feel threatened, it becomes very life-changing chemically, physiologically, developmentally. They start creating networks and chemical pathways and entire systems in their body that is designed to address emergencies and surviving, which is very different than thriving, right? So this is very important for us to remember that in the first phase of development, to make sure that that child's thrive is maintained as optimally thriving as much as possible. So their health, their sleep, their movements, all the stuff that goes into developing that brain and making the different parts of it connect become very, very important. So that's the first phase, basically. All right. So going through that, there are some key points in that we need to talk about, but we're going to come back to it. The second phase is the phase where the child discovers from 3 years to 6 years of age that, hey, I am separate from the world outside. So if you have heard of the terrible twos, for instance, which sometimes last a little bit longer than that, where the kids learn the word no, and they are exercising their free will. You tell them to do something and they're going to try something different. This is the phase where they're actually starting to understand that not only are they separate from the world, but also they're connected in the sense that when they do something, there's a consequence. So they're starting to understand that there are rules to this world, rules by which they have to live within. So you say, don't touch the stove, it's hot, or be careful climbing the stairs, or whatever we tell them basically in those ages. This is the part where they are looking for security in the sense that they want to understand, have a good understanding of what makes the world go around. They are curious in understanding these rules and the consequences. So again, there's a very important thing that parents need to do in this phase so that the kids make sure that they go through this and have the best and most clear understanding of what is going on inside of them and how it impacts the world and what the consequence between the two are. Like if I sleep late, I'm going to wake up tired. If I don't eat, I'm going to end up being hungry. If I throw a tantrum, I might get time out, whatever it happens to be. So those rules become important for them to understand. And when they see the repetition, and when they see that time and time again, if they do one thing, they get the same exact result every single time, they understand that there are definitely set boundaries in the universe. And that gives them a feeling of security and stability. All right. That allows them to start feeling confident about themselves. For most of us, when we're growing up thinking, oh, you know what, you have to let the kids explore and discover. There are phases for each of these, and your parenting style needs to adjust because of these different phases. So in this particular phase, it is important for them to get that message of stability and consistency. All right. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Then there's phase 3. This phase is from like age of 6 or so to about age of 9. So this is the phase where now they are viable. They understand some basic rules of the world and how it operates. Now they are going to go ahead and try to experiment with these rules. They're going to put it into use. So this is the part where they start connecting and reaching out to the world. The first phases of socialization, finding friends, hanging out with people, knowing how to get along, how to play together. So this networking that becomes important, and that's the central thing in their lives, basically. So if you are a helicopter parent and constantly kind of not letting them try to make these connections or try to fix their problem for them, what ends up happening is they kind of lose that problem-solving ability for themselves. So we're going to talk about what we need to do as far as our parenting style in this phase. So this is the phase where they're learning to venture out and socialize. And then the last part of this is the phase 4 is age 9 to 12, or basically before teenage years and puberty and things like that settle in. What ends up happening is during that phase, they are learning to put it all together and venture out and experiment. This is where they know their social network. They are forming a sense of identity for themselves. They're trying it out to see what they like, what they don't like. They're forming opinions. So again, in this particular phase, it's important to let them actually try things, fail at it, and then try to fix it. All right. So again, this is one of those places where now it's more important than ever for you to have a supportive role, but not a fixer role, basically, for the parents, basically. So if you go through this, and bear in mind, like what I've described so far goes only up to the age of 12, right? So for most of us, we think a 12-year-old is too little to be let alone to go through all of these phases. So we kind of shelter them for their own protection. The trouble is now you hit the teenage years, and in teenage years, they're establishing their sense of identity. So if they never discovered risk-taking activities and risk assessment, if they never discover what they stand for, what they stand against, if they never moved enough to understand their body in space, if they never discovered what different feelings feel like and be able to communicate that to others, and how to work cooperatively with other people, now during teenage years, when they're trying to establish their identity, this becomes an issue. These things start surfacing. So oftentimes, as the parent whisperer, people come to me and they're like, my child is having this issue, or I'm having this issue with my child. And they are a lot of times happening to be in the puberty, pre-adolescent, teenage years. And you can clearly see that this had some root in those 4 phases of development that we just talked about. And because of that, right now at the teenage years, that is not the time for parents to enforce and exert influence, because any influence that you give the child at that point is obstructing their development of their sense of identity. And even though they might know that that is the right decision to make, because you suggested it as a parent, it debilitates them from being able to separate whether that decision was yours or theirs. So that becomes a challenge for them. So they reject your idea despite knowing better. All right. This is why teenage years don't make sense to us, because we know our kids know better, but yet they're trying out to see what happens if they don't do what the rules say. All right. How are we doing on time, Liddy?
It is good. No, you can keep it. It's fascinating, and I love to talk with neuro scientists, because you always pointing out some aspect that we see in our child, but we don't really fully understand. And it's always good to have that reminder. You were telling the 4 phases. Is it general, or is it specific for those who have been diagnosed with ADHD?
So those things could be a little bit different. So let me just tell you a little bit more about the brain development and what brings about these phases of development. I already mentioned to you guys that brain kind of switches sides and areas of development at certain periods of time. So the way the brain typically, when you're born, what happens is you go through the natural process of birthing, then there is nursing, and all of these serve a purpose in the child's life. Crawling, all of those things, being carried, being touched, experimenting with different textures, seeing different lights, all of those. Initially, babies are very sensory driven because our senses are what stimulate these different brain centers. So initially, the babies are driven by senses. Later on, these senses start activating the motor areas of the brain. So now the baby becomes more coordinated, is able to hold their head up, able to sit up, able to stand or walk. So that's the phase where their motor is developing. And then this process continues basically until the child is mobile, can do things, and can eat solid foods, and can go ahead and have intention behind their activities. Those are the first phases. Now, this process naturally requires many different brain centers to fire up simultaneously. Just like a concert, though, you need to have a maestro. And in your brain, in the deeper parts of your brain stem, you have this part is basically like the metronome. The inferior olive is the metronome to the rest of your brain. So it synchronizes these things. And what ends up happening is that metronome gets its beat, gets calibrated through the senses and through movement. So if a child is always in a carrier of some sort, then that child, if that child never gets belly time, if that child doesn't get touched, if that child doesn't get to hear different voices talk to him, then what ends up happening is that metronome is going to be a little bit disconnected from certain brain parts. And this is the beginning of some of these symptoms that we we're talking about that you were just mentioning, that is their development different. So because there is lack of stimulation to some of these areas, then those areas don't grow as fast as the rest of the brain, don't connect to the other brain centers quite as well. So this can become quite extensive as far as explanation. But what happens is our brain is a reality emulator. So if you think about it, this organ is entrapped in your skull, right? It has no real connections to the universe. It's in this dark place in a fluid so that it doesn't even sense movement because it's shielded from jarring motions. But yet it has to know what colors look like, what smells are coming from, and it has to be able to move in space and really know about the universe. So it literally has to recreate the universe inside of itself in the form of chemical and neurologic electrical signals. So if these signals that are coming in get interpreted at different times because the metronome is off, they might be connected together completely differently than someone else. So they might be related events that could be construed as unrelated events or vice versa. So if you have a child, for instance, that looks at a cake, loves eating cake, sticks their finger in it and eats it before they've had a chance to sing happy birthday, you're going to get upset that socially that is not appropriate, that your child needs to understand that. But the reality is, from that child's perspective, they did nothing wrong. And if they had to make the choice again, they would make the same exact choice. All right. And this becomes a source of frustration for parents. You have to understand our brain is not fully developed. The frontal cortex, the frontal part of the brain, doesn't develop until the age of 6. That part is responsible for focus, decision-making, executive functions, prioritization, and socialization, and empathy. So if that part is not developed and you go ahead and reprimand the child for it, then what ends up happening is the child doesn't know why he did what he did. But now when he encounters that situation again, he is going to feel anxious about it. Now, this can translate into one of two forms. Either he's going to become an anxious person, or he's going to reflect back at how he never can make the right decision based on the reactions that you give him. And he's going to get depressed that he's not smart enough or he's inadequate in some way, right? And by the same token, that metronome does the same thing. If the metronome beats too slow, it tends to be behind the beat, right? So if you know people who are chronically late, this is a byproduct of something like that, that the time management is not quite there. So these people also tend to have a more depressive personality. By the same token, you have people who are super anxious, right? They show up an hour before an event and they're nervous and they've prepared and they're sweating, and those are the anxious people, right? That metronome is beating way too fast. They're always ahead of time. The happiest place for us to be is right on the beat. All right. So it is far more important for us to be on time than before or after the beat. All right. So this becomes a very important issue. So you were talking about the phases of development. These phases have to be on time. If they happen too early, like if you know people who crawled early or they never crawled and they went into walking, guess what? Some area of the brain didn't get developed properly. By the same token, some people end up walking way too late, speaking way too late. Guess what? As the brain starts shifting to another center for development, that part that was supposed to develop didn't have enough time to develop. So later on, when the kids go back to school, getting ready to start school, all of a sudden, when the brain is switching back to that side and the next layer is ready to be built, you see that that child might have impulsivity, you might see that that child has focusing issues. And now it's a learning disability, or it's a behavioral issue where the counselors send the kid home or ask you to show up. So these kind of things happen. And then this just goes on. And many times we just accept it as like, oh, my son, my daughter, that's just who they are. They're shy, or they don't have an inside voice. They're too loud, or they're obnoxious, or they're funny, or they're really hard on themselves. Realize that by making sure that that brain is optimally developing and you understanding those 4 phases of development, you can go ahead and make sure that that brain thrives. And in thriving, it becomes sociable, it becomes capable of empathy, it becomes good academically, physically, emotionally, so on and so forth, and ultimately feels connected to the rest of the world. One of the issues with autism spectrum disorders, oftentimes they call those kids disconnected kids. They're not really connected to what's going on around them. It's because those parts of the brain, and certain parts of their brain, are not really fully developed to the point where they can make that connection. Some of this stuff we value and we push in our society, like academics, but then in other parts we neglect them, like when we talk about arts, for instance, and music and those type of things. So depending on where the values in society are, we also tend to shift our brain development in different ways as well. What you want to do if you want to raise a happy child is to make sure that they grow up balanced, that you're always there showing them support, showing them love, that their survival is not threatened, and that even if they make the wrong decision, even if they make mistakes, that is actually part of growth, part of development. Whether you're an adult or whether you're a child, making mistakes is natural. It's something that is not built into our system. We punish people who make mistakes, and that is counter nature. Nature is designed for trial and error. That's how we learn.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I know that you are going to talk a little bit more about that subject in your free offer. Can you please tell us more about what we are going to learn from the free offer?
Sure. So the gift that I have for you is a training video. It's a brief training video, but nevertheless, it has 3 key principles to unlocking your child's potential. So as I was mentioning earlier, many times people think, oh, you know what, my child is just shy, or my child is just not good at math. And in doing so, we kind of not demand, but we just don't expect them to pursue it any further, and we don't push it. And while there are certain phases where you're not supposed to push, there are certain times in a child's life where you want to make sure you restore that balance in their brain, so that they have a balanced brain, basically, as they get older. Because once you reach teenage years and puberty, then you go from a time when you can actually map and engineer the brain to a period where now whatever things are the weak areas, you have to learn to compromise and compensate for. And then as you pass through and then go into adulthood, now you have technically, quote unquote, handicaps, things that you're going to always have to fight against. These are going to become shortcomings. These are things that are your weaknesses that you always need extra help and extra attention for, and extra support for it. So wouldn't it be great to be able to have a base level of competence in all different aspects of your life, be it relationships, be it choosing a career, or be it that you know what your passion is and what you stand up for and what you stand against, and forming a sense of identity that allows you to have meaningful relationships, meaningful jobs, and a fulfilling life.
Yes, this is much needed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I believe that, those only 30 minutes was not enough. It's so much information, and it's so deep and so interested. So thank you very much for that. So just one more question before ending, because I have it in mind. You said that the teenage age, it's about self-identity. So that means that as parents, we really need to focus between the birth through 12 years of age.
Right.
Because after that, because sometimes the parents don't do much, they just let their children be. And then during adolescence, they try to fix. But now you are telling us that no, we need to parent. We need to know how to parent through birth, through 12 years of age. So then when they are in their teenage period, they know who they are, and they would be able to confront the world and to be able to advocate for themselves.
I want to be very clear on this, that your parenting never ends.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So, and it's never too late to step in and help or make changes. So, like we know that even stroke victims into old age, if they have a stroke, they still can regain a lot of the things that they lose in the stroke within the next 12 months right after the stroke. So we know that neuroplasticity exists throughout life. So it's never too late to change it, but you can make the biggest impacts pre-adolescence. Now, having said that, what I also want to emphasize is that just like the brain goes through these phases and evolves, your relationship, your parenting also has to evolve through the ages. So when you're talking about children before the teenage years, that is the traditional what we think of as parenting, right? And then from the teenage years until they become young adults, that's the gray area where the child is establishing their identity, separating who they are versus who you are, and basically building a platform to build their adult life on. If that is messed around with and tweaked, then these children become very unsettled as they are adults. So if you've seen people who are in their 20s and 30s and still living with their parents, and they've got issues with their identity, or they have clashes with their parents, is because that relationship didn't evolve. And as the child comes out of the teenage years, now your relationship from parent to mentor to a friend, it has to go through those phases. So when you have an adult child, you are a friend to them. You could be a mentor to them, but you are not going to tell them, did you eat your food? Do you need to go to the bathroom? Right. And it's funny because one of these, I was like, I don't know, 38, 39 or something. And I was calling my mom, and she was telling me, it's like, make sure that you drive safely. I'm like, Mom, I've been driving for 20 years. I know how to drive. And if I haven't learned to drive safely by now, guess what? I'm never going to pick that up. So your relationship needs to evolve. And as parents, sometimes we forget that we need to show them the love and the support and change.
Yes, definitely. So thank you. Thank you very much for clarifying those points. It is important, and that's why I was saying that we need to evolve the parenting skills. We cannot parent a newborn as we parent a preschooler, or even a teenager, or, as you said, an adult adult child. So thank you very much for your expertise. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your free offer. This is so much value, and I appreciate your works. And I'm sure that you are going to support and help families to leave a legacy, because this is your mission, and you are in the track to do so. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And it was a pleasure to have also the viewers. Thank you for sticking around and for watching this interview. So this is Dr. L, the whisperer, and he will be able also to make an impact into your family. He's going to have the free offer available. So please do not hesitate to click on the link and to get advantage of that free offer. Thank you again. And remember that we want you to have a healthier family relationship. See you tomorrow, and thank you again.